The science of murder, the analysis of dangerous new psychedelic drugs, and the fingerprints and trace evidence left behind by suspects at crime scenes are just some of the topics that I'm going to be discussing with a panel of forensic science investigators later this month. And you can come along for free. A special public event to celebrate 50 years of Forensic Science Ireland is going to take place at the National Convention Centre in Dublin on May 28th. The doors are at 6 p.m. and tickets are available now on eventbrite.com. Don't miss it.
So, Eamon, Niall has actually taken time off for once, and Nicola is busy with other Crime World matters, which means you're stuck with me again. But bear with me.
Absolute pleasure.
You say that with surprise in your voice,
No, it's not surprise. It's sincerity.
So the Richard Satchwell trial, today is day 14 of evidence. So you've been covering this really extensively for Crime World. And I suppose people don't need me to say it now at this point, but Richard Satchwell has denied the murder of his wife Tina in their home in Youghal, County Cork in March 2017. His case is that she died after attacking him with a chisel while he tried to defend himself. And I suppose this case is now in its fourth week, so we've heard a lot of evidence. And today we heard from a cousin of Tina who described her relationship with Tina and also her dealings with Richard in the wake of her disappearance.
Yeah, so this week, as you say, the fourth week, we heard evidence from different people that Richard Satchwell would have mentioned during his interviews with the guards. And so, you know, even going back to last Friday, we would have had, say, Sarah Dobson, who sold the Chihuahua named Ruby to Tina Satchwell. And she spoke about her encounter with Richard Satchwell after, you know, Tina had left him, according to him. And we heard then this week on Monday from John Keohane, who's another car boot sale person, who Tina had told him that she'd never do anything to hurt Richard, and this was in the context of him joking about she was after buying a lovely dress and she had some perfume and that she must be going out to see another man. And we also heard from an Angela Sheehan, who Richard had described as Tina's best friend. And she gave evidence that they were just acquaintances. She didn't know where she lived, didn't have her number, and they just knew each other from the sauna in the swimming pool in Fermoy.
Okay.
And so, like on that vein, then as well, like we had Dr. O'Grady, who was called back again about her dealings with the Satchwells as a GP in Fermoy. And then today was I suppose the main witness who was on the stand certainly for the longest was Sarah Howard, a cousin of Tina's.
Yeah.
And she was. She was saying like she was led through her kind of evidence and that she would have spent a lot of time together swimming, going downtown, walking the dog, chatting in the house. She described Tina as kind-hearted, loved animals, a genuinely lovely person. And they played a clip from Primetime, I think it was in 2018 when this was played. And that was already played in the case as part of showing the different media interviews that were shown to the jury that Richard Satchwell had given in the wake of his wife's, what was then considered a missing persons case in wake of her disappearance. And she was you could see that she was quite emotional. She had to compose herself a few times today. But when this was played, and it was, you know, she's given this interview to Barry Cummins from Primetime, and they're walking around, I think, in Youghal, it looks like. And she talked about her love of fashion and swimming and walking stuff. She'd never gone missing before. It's a complete mystery. It's tearing us apart, not knowing that every day she's checking her phone. If she gets a missed call, she gets nervous. And there's so many things going on in everyone's heads that she has no answer, and there's a possibility it mightn't be good news that comes out of it.
Yeah.
She says nobody can just disappear without somebody knowing. So this is her speaking in 2018. She's sitting in the dock while the jury are also watching this, and she is emotional at that point. So she's asked again.
So that's, sorry, just to put it in context, that's 7 years ago when this.
Yeah. So this is January 2018, probably a little bit longer.
Okay.
And so again, like she was asked then about the last time she saw Tina. So she was saying that was it was just before Christmas time, 2016. So that's like 3 months before her disappearance or her murder, as the state alleges. And she described it as being in great form. We had a great chat. The dogs were with her, and said that she didn't go anywhere without her dogs. When she found out, on the day she found out she was missing, later, you know, it's in March, she rang Tina's phone straight away and there wasn't an answer. And then she ended up having a eventually having a conversation with Richard Satchwell, having rung him, and I think it took 2 phone calls for him to whatever before they managed to make contact. And she asked him where she was and why the dogs weren't with her and what happened. And he told her the story that we've heard several times now, that they just had an argument and she had left him, and he said that he'd thrown a cup at her or something, and that she took a sum of money. He'd found the keys in the floor when he came back from an errand in Dungarvan, and the suitcases as well he'd mentioned that were taken. And he said that they'd been at a car boot sale that day, and she'd made a comment to him that she had wasted 20 years of her life with him. And she said in court, like, I'd never heard any of that before. So this is from a woman who has been, is close to Tina, or spent a lot of time with her.
Yeah.
And she was asked then, did you have further contact with Richard Satchwell? And they went through these phone messages that were downloaded. Now, we actually heard this before on day 5, on the 7th of May, from David Kelleher, the incident room coordinator.
Yeah.
And he had downloaded the phone using the Cellbrite software, and they were able to get the different, as well as his geolocations. They also had any text messages he'd sent, and they went through some of the kind of the contact he had with her, and it was very, very much along the lines of him asking her, like, have you heard from Tina? Have you been in contact, with different relatives? Have they heard anything from her? Asking her to travel with him down to Killarney to visit a relative, and then him telling her he'd been down there, and they had no answers either. And then in one of these, and a bit later, he asked her, do you want a big chest freezer? And she was asked, did you respond to that? And this is in Today now when she's giving evidence. Did you respond to that? And she said no. And again, she was quite emotional. And she says, I just thought it was unusual. He said he wasn't the type to give away stuff. And she recalled a time when they were at the car boot sale with her 2 young children, when Richard and Tina were there, and there was a nail varnish in the CD that the children kind of wanted, and he charged them both 50 cents. So she was making the point it was very unusual. Yeah. But anyway, she didn't reply to that particular to that particular text from him.
Yeah.
And so they're going through again some of the some of the messages, including the time when the Coast Guard had found clothes, and he was asking her to come down, and there was messages back and forth about where and when, that sort of thing.
And remind us around what time were these messages happening?
These messages are what you heard today were kind of from they were from all the way from, say, the after the 26th of March. Like he went to the guards in Fermoy on the 24th of March in 2017. So these messages are kind of March, April, May, and into July.
Okay.
And they continue kind of then with when she sent him a message like, don't call out to the house. The kids got upset and ask where Tina is when she's not with you.
Yeah.
And and there was a message again that we heard before where he sends to her, and it was in the kind of a context of not really sure what it was in context with, to be honest, and it wasn't made clear. And he was mentioning that he loved her with all his being. She's my life, my everything. I cry all the time, even writing this text. And that was on the 27th of June, 2017, when we now know that his wife is in a clandestine grave, as it was put, under the stairs that he dug himself.
Yeah. So I suppose to just to recap quickly, Tina disappeared in March 2017. Richard formally reported her missing to the Gardaí, had been interacting with them, but formally reported her missing in May 2017. There was a search of the house in June 2017, but it wasn't an evasive search. And then these efforts to find her and various different TV interviews happened in the year following this. And then in October 2023, there was a much more invasive dig by Gardaí carried out on the house that Tina and Richard were living in. And Tina was discovered under the stairwell. She had actually been, and then that's when Richard told Gardaí that Tina had come at him with a chisel, and that while he was trying to defend himself, he held her off with the weight of a belt of her dressing gown, and she went limp and died during this struggle. He put her body into a chest freezer, held her there for 2 days, and then buried her under the stairs. And then she was obviously found 6 years later. So I suppose these text messages are then in the direct months after her initial disappearance.
And so she was asked then about them in cross-examination as well by Brendan Grehan, who's acting for Richard Satchwell. There was some kind of, she was explaining, she'd lived in different rented houses in Fermoy. And I said, would your contact have fallen off, after she moved to Youghal? And she said, yeah, but obviously not as much. And that if she did come to visit, Richard would be with her because Tina couldn't drive. And he was asked about her statement that she'd given to guards. I think it was a 2021 statement, and where she had mentioned that that Richard appeared to be devoted to her, and you described him as being besotted, and she said always with her.
Yeah.
And and she had also said that he couldn't really have caused her harm because he was so besotted with her. And she was asked about kind of Tina's relationships with other members of the extended Dingiven family and her biological mother, and the way she'd make contact. And she didn't really use her phone. She'd call to people's houses. She'd turn up. And again, she was never invited to her house in Youghal because she knew that that she was very house proud and didn't want it until the renovations had been done. So she didn't want necessarily people calling to see her house. She was asked, this is in reply to questions from Brendan Grant, she was aware that Tina had fallen out with her mother and that she didn't speak about her much to Sarah. And Sarah was aware that they weren't talking for a while, but they had never, she had never said anything directly. And she agreed that, the fallout had lasted some years. And she was asked, did Tina resent somewhat that her mother hadn't raised her, that she'd been brought up by her grandmother? And she said, I couldn't say. She had a very close bond with with her grandmother. And so Sarah is actually, they share obviously the same, they share the same grandmother, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
That her mother is an aunt of Tina's as well.
Okay. And did she describe, so Sarah described how close she was to Tina. Did she give any incidents where she, interacted with them as a couple?
Yeah, well, she said they were always together.
Yeah.
That if but she did remember. She was asked about her earliest memory, and she said, or when she first met her, and she said, well, probably when I was 2, but doesn't remember. And her earliest memories are probably around when she was 4 or 5, and she used to take her downtown, and she got her ears pierced, and it was her kind of basically, it was her favourite auntie Tina who had brought her down to get her ears pierced. And she was asked then about her brother. This is Tina's brother, who died by suicide in 2014. And she was asked, "Do you remember about that? Or how did it affect Tina?" And she said, "I'm not sure." And she said, "Well, what did it affect her in any way?" And she said, "I didn't see if it did." And then she was asked about how she became aware of that Tina was missing, and she said it was when she called to her mother's house, and again going through trying to call her, and thought it was strange that the dogs were left behind.
Yeah.
And she was asked about kind of work, the couple, the Satchwells, had done, and that she mentioned that at one point Tina had a job one job for a short time in a clothes shop in Cork, and that she, in the 10 years before she died, she didn't think she had a job, and that as far as she knew that Richard worked, but on and off. And she was aware of their habit of going to car boot sales as well, and that she loved she loved dressing up and loved her fashion, would always want to look perfect. If she was going to the shops for milk, she wouldn't go unless she was looking good, and she agreed to all this, that was true. And agreed, that again, that Richard Satchwell had shared the same story with her. He had told a number of people, which is this whole thing about, going to Dungarvan on an errand and coming back, and she wasn't there. And again, being struck by how, unusual that was. And she was asked again then, in terms of this violence that Tina is supposed to have inflicted on Richard, which Richard says he was the victim of this violence, that he suffered this violence in silence. And he'd mentioned in one of the interviews that he had never revealed this kind of dark side of Tina to people, and that he protected that secret.
Yeah.
And so she was asked, "You don't believe that Tina was violent?" And she said no, and that she had never personally seen her to be violent to anyone, and she wasn't aware, not sure if any other members of the family were aware that she could be violent. And again, it was very much it's very much kind of this is she was asked about her statement, and that you recall that you said on occasion that he had told her that
Yeah.
that Tina had been violent towards him, that she used to throw cups at him, and he had a load of scars on his head. And the reply to that was, that's what he said.
Yeah.
And
okay.
but again, she had never personally seen any violence.
Okay.
And that was the last contact then, apart from a birthday card that arrived in 2017 in August. So we're still in 2017.
Yeah.
And it was hand delivered, and there was written on it to our niece, it was addressed to the niece, and it was signed by Tina and Richard, and there was 2 photographs in it, and she was asked to look at one of these, and it was my mum and Tina. It was her mother and Tina together.
And what month in 2017 was this?
This is in August. So
Tina was missing for a few months.
Yeah, and she didn't have any contact with him there.
Okay.
Thereafter.
Yeah,
and that was kind of. Apart from that, that was the main evidence today. That actually went into legal argument in the afternoon. The jury were told that there was a legal application going to be made, and they were told they weren't going to be needed tomorrow.
Okay.
But before she took the stand, there was a little bit of just kind of tidying up from the previous day.
Okay, yeah. So sorry, just before we go on to that, to go back to the text messages. So how was it explained how the text message or the text exchange between Sarah and Richard came to an end? Where, like, who had sent the last message, or was this around before the birthday card was sent? Or
it was before the birthday card. I think it was July was the last one, and some of them, there was no reply, and some of the indications that there was a missed call that wasn't replied to from, and there weren't. It wasn't a linear series of messages. The one conversation, they were like sometimes things out of the blue, like the offer for tickets to a concert in Cork was one of them, which he didn't reply to.
Yeah.
So there was a couple of kind of. Text messages, not many, but some of them that seem to have no bearing whatsoever on Tina, whereas the vast majority of them were kind of trying to keep in touch. Any news? How is she? Or have you heard anything? Or have the guard said anything? It was that kind of. That was the nature of the messages that were back and forth.
Yeah, there was a Purple Rain concerts.
Yeah, that was it. Yeah, she didn't respond to that particular message.
Okay, and then as you said, the last contact that she had with Tina, she kind of said how when Tina moved to Youghal, they didn't see as much of each other, and I think was it December 2016, so maybe 3-4 months before Tina disappeared was Sarah's last
it would have been
contact.
and again said they had a great chat and she was in good form, and she had both dogs, Ruby and Heidi, were with her at that stage.
Yeah, okay, and then just in relation to, as you said, there was a bit of tidying up, so there was more heard from a senior detective who was giving evidence around suitcases.
Yeah, well, this was something that happened in. It was in July, I think, in 2017 that he rang into the one of the Garda stations. I think it was in Youghal that he saw 2 suitcases that looked like the ones that Tina had taken beside a recycling centre in Tesco, and there was evidence that a patrol car was basically sent out, and they went and they took them away and spoke to him, and he confirmed to him, look, they're not actually Tina's suitcases; they just look like them, and they were photographed and taken away. So there was no great kind of discussion about this particular thing. It was just, I think, going through. What he was saying to the guards, I think, at that time. Yeah. And as well as that, we also had Garda Clinton Rock was back on the stand again, and he was the officer that we heard yesterday on the 26th of February in this year.
Okay.
We're kind of had a look again at the dressing gown that was found on her body when her remains were removed from the grave.
Yeah.
And they were looking for this wedding ring that he had mentioned in one of the interviews to see if they could find it. But of course they couldn't find it. And they were basically packaged up and put in again.
Yeah, and we'd heard, as people listening would know, we'd heard from Dr. Margaret Bolster, who had done the post-mortem examination. We heard from her this week, and she had said, she's done 30,000 examinations on people, I think, and she wasn't able to determine the cause of death. She couldn't identify any fractures to bones or anything like that. But there was talk of how they weren't actually able to show the belts from the dressing gown inside court because of
the deterioration and the staining. And so there was a kind of a visual aid was enacted by actually it was David Kelleher, the detective who's the incident room coordinator.
Yeah.
And he kind of the belt at the direction of Margaret Bolster was kind of wrapped around him, like, across from the base of the neck down to these kind of mid-torso, like I suppose, for lack of a slightly inaccurate description, but like the Sam Brown belt that you see senior Gardaí or army officers wear, where it's kind of it goes kind of down across the chest and look
similar to a seatbelt, or is that?
It was similar, yeah. It was kind of like a seatbelt, yeah. But it was one cord, it was one belt, like, and it was cut by Margaret Bolster, because they weren't able to remove it. She was worried that if you removed it like that, it would disintegrate. And as I think she also talked about, like, the state of the body, and the fact that there was no organs meant that they couldn't do any toxicology on the organs, the brain, the heart, the lungs, and to figure out if there were anything in her system. They were able to do some toxicology, an analysis on some hair, which would show if there were any drugs in the system in the 90 days before she died, and that there was nothing showed up on that.
Yeah, but the advanced state of decomposition made determining the cause of death.
Yeah, there was no. She couldn't determine a cause of death.
Okay, so it's been a busy few weeks of this trial, Eamon. As we said before, we're on week 4, and today the prosecution case closed. Yeah,
so it's a sign that I guess we're certainly getting towards the end. Yeah. But I mean, there's no, like, the jury asked how long it was going to last, and they were told at the outset that it's going to be a 5-week trial. So this is week 4. So it's there's been no change on that in terms of how long it's going to last. So as far as we're all concerned, it's a 5-week trial.
Okay, and I suppose I know it's not necessarily said to you, but we assume from what we know that obviously the prosecution opened their case. They go through their evidence. They're trying to prove the case against Richard Satchwell. That's now closed. So we assume that the defence will come next.
Yeah, we're back tomorrow morning, and we'll whichever witnesses are coming up, but they won't be working for the prosecution, or not working, but they won't be giving evidence on behalf of the prosecution. But the prosecution will be able to cross-examine as well, and if anything that's said, they can use that then in any summing up at the end. Yeah,
and then I suppose once the defence close, as you kind of said, then there will be the both will have a chance to close their give closing speeches, and then it will be up to the judge to deliver his charge to the jury on points of law and things that they need to be mindful of, and then they will go into deliberation. So I think the rough date was given the 5th or 6th of June for it to end, was it?
Well, he just said 5 weeks, the judge. He just gave him 5 weeks to the jury. And so he hasn't changed on that.
Yeah, and I suppose you've been. I know Nicholas asked you about the courtroom before, but it has been busy. There's been a lot of people in there.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of Garda witnesses, so there has been quite a few there, and there's always the possibility they'd be recalled. So even after they've given evidence, they're staying there.
Yeah,
there is quite a number of members of the public. It's not the biggest, I think, courtroom, but it's one of the biggest, so there's a bit of room.
Yeah.
So people have been coming in to look, including lawyers as well, who have been interested in hearing some of the case.
And have you've probably been too busy taking notes, but have you seen any Tina's family, or do we know if they're there?
I don't. There's nothing mentioned like that in court.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Eamon. You'll be back tomorrow?
Yes, I will indeed.
Thank you. I probably won't be, but thank you.
No worries. Cheers.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.